Do you vote? Can you vote? Why or why not? It's one of our most important rights as Americans. Some would say our duty, voting, the obstacles, the beliefs, the barriers. Our topic today on UCF Profiles with our guest, Dr. Terri Fine. I'm Charna Davis Wiese. Thank you for joining us. Thanks for coming out.
Thank you for inviting me.
There's so much to this, so much more complex, so much under the surface that affects us all and affects many of the people and things we care about, but we're really unaware of all the barriers there are to voting. And some are there as formal barriers, and some are informal. So I'd love to touch on the things that stop people from voting, the things that we would expect and the things that we won't. What are the most insidious things that are there that prevent people from voting that we may not even think of?
Well, what really is the most insidious is how we schedule our elections compared to other European countries and other democracies in the world. In the United States, we schedule our elections on Tuesdays, and that comes from a 200-year-old practice where when there were poll taxes, people needed money to pay the poll tax, so the elections had to be early enough in the week, but after the Sabbath, so that people could then ride to wherever they needed to get to vote. So we hold elections on Tuesdays. In Europe, elections are held on, they are made to be national holidays. They are held on whichever weekend day is not the Sabbath. In Israel, there are 3 Sabbaths, one for the Muslims, one for the Jews, one for the Christians. Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So elections in Israel are held on Thursdays. In the United States, we say it's an election day. We say that people are allowed to go and vote, and they're allowed 2 hours time off.
But you have to go at 5 o'clock in the morning to leave to stand in line to get there by 7.
You have to either wait in line, you might be docked pay if you take time off during the day. And because of our commuter culture, people live very far from where they work. So even if they're coming home from work or going before work, it still takes a lot of time to vote.
And it's almost impossible, especially in the last election. The lines were so long that people were afraid, by the time I get there, I'm going to stay in line so long, I'm not going to get to vote.
Right, but in the state of Florida, for the first presidential election, since the law went into effect in 2002, we had something called early voting. And early voting was a system where up to 2 weeks before the election at either a designated library or the supervisor of elections office, people could go and vote. But people still waited in line for long periods of time, but at least you could go and vote on a Saturday or Sunday if you wanted to.
I was going to ask you, Dr. Fine, did that work? Do you think that worked?
Oh yes, in fact, between absentee votes and early voting, over 1/3 of Florida's voting population voted before Election Day in 2004.
Really? Mm-hmm. What I did is, because my schedule is so insane with school and work and the kids, is I got an absentee ballot and went and walked over to the polling place and gave it in. Mm-hmm. And I was surprised. Hardly anybody I knew you could do that.
Yeah, people are generally far less informed than they could be about what the rules and the regulations are, such as absentee ballots. For example, if you have an absentee ballot but you're not in the active military, that absentee ballot must be received by the time the polls close, which is 7 p.m. in Florida. But if you are on active military and you're at a base somewhere around the world, you only need to have that postmarked by Election Day. The significance is that if I'm vacationing in Europe and I want to mail my ballot from Europe and I mail it November 3rd, it's not going to get there. Perhaps.
And you're not in the military, so it's not going to count.
But if I was on a military base in Germany and I mailed it on Election Day, it's going to count. And so people don't understand the subtleties, but that make a big difference in terms of which votes get counted and which ones don't.
What about people who can't get there? They just can't get there. They're elderly. They don't have vehicles. There's not necessarily public transportation to get them there.
Well, absentee votes can be mailed in as long as they are received in time for Election Day, but people
and they have to have the
that.
information to ask for the absentee ballot in time.
Right.
Okay. How about some of the other ways of discrimination against voters?
Well, some of the other informal barriers are that there are populations out there that have the right to vote, but that don't get the kind of information about the election that you and I take for granted. For example, you and I take for granted that our mailbox is going to get a lot of materials, whether we like it or not. We're going to get a lot of things mailed to us. Mm-hmm. We're going to get telephone calls. Okay? Well, in the state of Florida, if a person is accused of a felony, if they've been charged with a felony and they're waiting in jail, if they have been convicted of a misdemeanor and they're in jail, they are eligible to vote. However, because of the nature of the jail system, they're not going to get all that stuff, either in their telephone, through phone calls, or through the mail. And candidates aren't going to go and visit the jails. What candidate would do that?
Right.
Okay. And plus, because people can't use the jail as their residency, even if they've been there for 2, 3, or 4 years. Right. That means that a candidate, unless that candidate is running for statewide office for a large enough district, that means that the people in the jail might not even be eligible to vote for him or her anyway.
Right. And talking about the who's voting for where and which districts, we talk about the districting of voting and the way that not every place in Florida chooses their elected officials the same way. And there's a big problem. In fact, what happened in Osceola County and the lawsuit going on there. Can we talk about that a little bit? Oh,
absolutely. In Osceola County, they use a system called Atlarge, which means that there are no specific districts in place. What it is that people are elected district-wide, county-wide, or city-wide, depending on if it's the city of Kissimmee or Osceola County. They're elected at large, meaning that they serve the entire geographic area. But for minority populations, it's very, very difficult, either because of the cost or because of the size of the district. If it's a majority white district, then it's going to be easier for whites to be elected because people tend to vote for one of their own. Women tend to vote for women, whites tend to vote for whites, Hispanics tend to vote for Hispanics. But Osceola County has one of the fastest growing Hispanic populations in the state, if not the fastest growing Hispanic population.
1 out of every 3 voters is Hispanic there, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's much higher than it used to be. So it turns out that there have been Hispanics who are arguing that it's the electoral structure that's keeping Hispanics from getting elected. When you have district-based, or what they call single-member district-based elections, a person is representing a much smaller area, but still serving at the county level or the city level.
And could also then be the person to go ahead and talk about the issues that are important to that group that put them there.
Right. It's a lower cost election, and because in various areas of the state that you have high population densities of either African Americans or Hispanics, say African Americans in Orange County or Hispanics in Osceola, that means that if a person runs from a district that is predominantly of that one race group, they're more likely to get elected than to try to run county-wide or citywide.
So the thought is, because there were so many Hispanic voters, there should have been at least 1 seat on that commission that went to a Hispanic official, but it didn't happen.
Well, it almost happened.
Almost happened.
Right, there were 2 people who had run for, one for county commission, I believe, and one for city council, who went to bed having been winners. And they counted the absentee ballots after the polls had closed, and really after the networks had stopped broadcasting, after the networks had declared the winners. But the absentee ballots, which can be in as of 7 p.m. the night of the election, were still being counted. And so when they woke up the next day, they had lost. So, not to be funny, but this is sort of a reverse Harry Truman. Harry Truman went to bed a loser and woke up a winner. Here were 2 gentlemen who went to bed winners, and woke up losers.
What a shock.
Yeah.
What a shock. So then the Justice Department stepped in and filed a lawsuit.
Yes, they did. Yes, they did.
Saying that basically the Hispanic vote may have been diluted, which is against the law.
Yeah, well, vote dilution is actually one of the amendments to the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act was originally enacted at the federal level in 1965. It did not include a provision for vote dilution. The provision for vote dilution was added to the Voting Rights Act amendments in 1982. There are many people who are concerned because those provisions had a 25-year lifetime, which is going to end in 2007. So many people are concerned about the Voting Rights Act sort of dying in 2007. It's not going to die per se, but rather it's going to be harder to sue for discrimination. You're going to have to prove through courts rather than having an executive agency looking out for you.
I was going to ask you, being a scholar of politics, if you had a crystal ball, what would you think is going to happen?
Oh, I think that not that much is going to happen, because I think that the Voting Rights Act is one of those social policies that has had one of the most significant, measurable, positive effects on political participation when we compare it to any other social policy. And when I mean social policy, I mean giving women the right to vote, giving young people the right to vote. If we look at data from 1964 to 65, meaning just before the Voting Rights Act, in the 9 deep South Southern states, and then we look again in 1971, so we're talking 5-6 years later, the increase in registration is dramatic. The increase in voter turnout is dramatic. And one of the positive consequences of the right to register and the right to vote is that there are now more and more African Americans who are running and winning. And so that means that we have more representative legislatures than we did before.
Of the population. And in some communities it may reverse. For example, in Miami, it will be I don't know if it is already or will be sometime in the very near future, Hispanics will be the majority. So everything could turn around, and it's probably going to be best in the long run the way it has changed and the positive changes we're seeing.
Well, the reality is that people tend to pay closer attention to those to which they can relate. So it's going to be much easier for a Hispanic candidate to reach out and to inform Hispanic voters who are going to more likely listen to that Hispanic candidate than, say, to a white candidate. So I'm not saying that because there's a lack of diversity in the legislature that that's a bad thing. I'm saying it's not representative.
Right, and you never know who it's going to benefit because the population shift. They change the political parties that they align with. However, it will benefit the people who are voting and want their representation.
Right, they're likely to be better informed and have higher turnout, which is what I consider to be positive.
And you know, the last election had really high turnout. As I said, I stood in line just to hand in my absentee ballot. Do you think is that a change in the tide? Is it a more informed population? Is it, as we were talking earlier, is it a post 9/11 interest, or is that a one-time thing, you think?
People are not necessarily better informed. One of the reasons is because people's attention spans have really come down. If you want to look at just one little statistic, but it speaks volumes, in the 1972 presidential election, the average soundbite was 32.7 seconds.
Oh, you can't do that anymore on television.
It's 8.9. Okay, and what a soundbite is that means that that's the candidate who has no control over the news coverage that he's getting. So he's going to say something that he believes that whoever is reporting this will give from start to finish.
They take a little snippet out.
Right. Well, the snippet used to be about 33 seconds. Now the snippets are down to 9 seconds because there's so much competition in the news business with cable and more networks that people are having to put in more information in a 30-minute news show, and that means that sound bites have shrunk and there's less information in 9 seconds. It amazes me
because I spent half of my adult life in the news business, in a newsroom, from the time I was 18, and when CNN started and when all these cable, we thought, whoa, as reporters, we have all this time to tell our story and go in depth, and it didn't happen. It's just the same 8 seconds over and over again. And it's amazing how that happened. It really didn't help the people very much.
Yeah.
Let's talk about 2000. I would love it for my in-laws and my relatives in other states to not be the butt of jokes, the Florida jokes, and so much went wrong.
Yeah.
Do you think it's just we were under the microscope? Or do you think it's just so much is changing in Florida and so much is fluid?
Well, it's actually, what went wrong in Florida, first of all, not only had gone wrong in other states, but also had gone wrong before.
But it wasn't such a close election.
It was the closeness of the election that was the issue. So it was really what went wrong was the campaign strategy. Gore didn't campaign enough in Florida to get a certain enough margin, and Bush didn't campaign enough in Florida to get a certain enough margin. Because if you look at the Government Accounting Office, which is part of the executive branch, if you go on the internet, you can look up Government Accounting Office, voter irregularities in Google or something like that, and you will get a report that talks about these same problems in Texas, Illinois, Indiana. There's no real regional bias. But it just so happens that in Florida, there was just not enough campaigning. Or you could argue that it was really Gore's mistake, meaning that Gore, who was a congressman and then a senator from his home state of Tennessee, starting in 1976, and then nominated for vice president in 1992, his home state of Tennessee then had voted for him between 76 up to 96. That was 11 Electoral College votes. that would have made the difference. So even with Florida, had Tennessee gone for their local favorite son,
A homegrown son,
which is a term that we use, a favorite son, instead of Bush, then even had Bush won Florida, the 11 electoral votes going to Gore would not have mattered, because you need 270 electoral votes to become president. Bush had 271, Gore had 267.
Right, that's the big difference. And you talk about the electoral votes in the Electoral College. It's probably something we learned in middle school and forgot about. And now all of a sudden it's in the focus again because it made a difference. But that's probably not going to change.
Oh, it's not. It's going to require a constitutional amendment. And just as a little statistic, there have been 27 amendments to the Constitution and 10,000 amendments introduced.
Wow.
So the odds aren't very good.
It's probably not going to happen. So what we have going on here is, at least now, at least in Florida, people have, as we talked about, a sense of efficacy.
Yeah.
And they know that their one little vote may be very, very important. I told you that in my family we have, it seems like we're a mixture of all different religions, all different political ideologies, we're just a real wonderful mix of Americana. And there'd be these just juicy fights over dinner about politics. And then I would say, as being the only voting member of the family, so why don't you vote? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. But now people see it does.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if you just looking at numbers, the difference between Gore and Bush in 2000 was 537 votes. And in Florida in 2000, Ralph Nader got 98,000 votes. So had 1% of Nader voters voted for Gore instead, because they were both perceived as more aligned on the environment than when compared with Bush, Gore would be president.
Poor Ralph Nader.
Okay. But what I'm saying is, so people blame Ralph Nader.
It's
the
not
problems with the felons list, the problems with the equipment, those have been documented by the Government Accounting Office for years, and any one of us could find it on the internet, and it's a free report.
And the amazing thing is that when you think of the millions of people who vote in this country, it's probably the majority that went right. It probably went right than went wrong. And it can't be perfect with that kind of number of people involved. Okay, let's talk about getting people out to the polls.
Right.
And it was so much fun watching Bruce Springsteen and the concerts and all of the youth that's coming out. The youth cares, and I was very active when I was in college, but none of my friends were. They thought I was some kind of geek. And it was so sad to see when it came to time to go to the polls, they all slept in.
They did.
What do you think happened there? And why was their vote so important anyway?
Well, their vote was so important because because when you have a state like Florida, which decided the presidential election by 537 votes, then that means that even a low turnout, a low numerical population can still have an impact on the election.
Even on the college campuses, if they just would have done that.
And the issues between them, right? It's that college age. It's their peers who are being sent overseas, and it's their concerns about their future in terms of, will I have a job?
The environment.
So there are all kinds of issues that resonated well with young people on both sides, which increase their participation level. But as I tell my students, the problem with the young vote is that your parents didn't have enough children. Okay,
there's no more baby boomers.
That's right. They are the baby bust generation. I said the average family size now is 1.9 children. I said I'm a family of 5. 4 houses down was a family of 4. Across the street was a family of 4. We were the baby boom generation. And since votes, it doesn't matter why you vote. All that matters is how many votes are in one column or the other column. So the fact that my generation is so much larger than theirs is really one of the reasons why they're so ignored, which is why when candidates and parties do reach out to young people, they do somewhat respond.
And you know, it's true what you say, because I'm one of 5. And when people hear that I have 3 children, it's like I said to them, I have 3 heads.
Yes.
Everyone is so shocked at the massive size of my family. And when I was growing up, everybody had 3, 4, 5, 6 kids.
Easily.
So what's that going to change when they grow up and they are the primary voters? It's going to really change the face of everything, isn't it?
Well, it's just going to reduce the number of people voting. Really. And if they're not voting, see,
Nobody will be.
Unlike, I mean, we do have a student audience for this program, and a lot of our students are involved with student organizations such as student government. They might be involved in sororities, fraternities. For any of those organizations to vote on anything, they can start the meeting, but they have to have something called a quorum.
Right.
A quorum is a minimum percentage of people have to be there to vote on anything. You don't need that in elections. And so as long as you have 3 people voting and 2 vote for one and 1 votes for the other, there's nothing illegal or unconstitutional about that election. So we are of this impression that we really should have high voter turnout for the sake of a good election. Well, it is for people like me who believe in participation, but not for constitutional reasons or legal reasons. It's for, I think, democratic reasons, but not for legal reasons.
How did you get here? You know, I love to ask people that. Little Terri Fine in middle school, when you were going to see the Rocky Horror Picture Show, did you think that you would be a PhD and so involved in politics and political science?
No, I failed a lot. And it was my failures that taught me the best lessons.
Isn't that wonderful? And people don't, and kids don't realize that because
they don't.
They so beat themselves up.
They really do. And let me just give you sort of the 2 most important failures. I took music lessons all my life, and so I never was really good enough to get beyond sort of the New York State high school orchestra or whatever it was.
I was in the Florida one,
well,
so we have a lot in common.
There you go. So I started college. I was double majoring in music and political science. I got interested in political science because I took a course in high school that the course was basically a local college said to the teacher, if you use our textbook, we will give these students 3 credit hours when they finish. So I said, oh, it's a great way, I'll save some tuition money later on. It's sort of what we now use as dual enrollment. So that got me interested, and then I took a music major, took music theory, failed the first midterm, quit the music major. Yeah, just quit it. And then I ended up then transferring to another school. Majored in political science, they required a minor. I was always interested in voting statistics, which you've already commented on. Okay, so I said, okay, I'll minor in statistics. Failed the first 4 quizzes.
No.
Okay, but you had to minor in something. So I went to this professor, called him at home, which is nerve I don't even have anymore. I said, I'm desperate. I have to drop this course. What am I going to minor in? Well, the next day we spent 4 hours together. And we looked at my record, and he said, well, what are you interested in? I said, well, I like to read. Well, why don't we get you an English minor? And then that way, we'll get you this political science major. And as it happens, they were starting a brand new program where if you took up to 3 courses at your undergraduate level, if you took them at the graduate level as an undergraduate, they would count towards both degrees. So I immediately signed up for the GRE, and then I was the first student in this new program at the university where I was. So where I ended up was because I took college courses in high school, because I took a double major, which meant extra credit hours, because I failed and asked for help. Okay, I was 21 when I got my bachelor's degree, 22 when I got my master's degree, and 26 when I got my PhD. And it's not because I'm all that bright, okay? It's because I asked for help. And that's a very important lesson for people to hear, because students, it's when they're failing that I want to see you. If you're doing great, I'll say hi. I think that's wonderful.
And they tend to, when they're
you.
having trouble, disappear.
They disappear. They don't come for help. And I think it's just really very important for people to realize that we ultimately find our path. We don't know how that path will come out. We don't know what that path's going to look like. But if you follow your heart and say, okay, I like reading. Okay, what about an English minor? And I ended up, it turns out I was taking enough English electives that I only needed a couple more classes for the English minor so I could graduate early. And yes, I felt like a failure at the music major, but look at what I got out of it. I'm talking to you now. I'm not shaking, I'm not sweating, I'm not nervous,
Right.
because we had performance seminars. So at the age of 18, you have to perform in front of all these people. And so it's very easy then to then transfer that to a classroom environment.
So you can take something out of everything you do. And I'll tell that to my kids if they're they get something wrong on a test and they're so upset about it. I said, you will never forget the right answer.
Right.
You'll never forget the right answer. But it must be so hard as a professor, because there you are, and to them, I mean, you're where they feel they can't achieve. And it must be very hard for you to really get that into their heads that, don't worry about it. It's going to come out all right. There are no mistakes. You're going to come out the other end.
Right. And I think another very important issue is that there's so much emphasis on grades. And I say, focus on the learning and the grades will come.
That's true. So what do you think? What do you think is the future of voting and voting rights? And do you think more people are going to vote? Is it going to stay the same? Or are there going to be the same problems? What do you think is going to happen?
Well, I think that if there's more of an effort made to galvanize those groups that want to vote but that are facing various barriers. Okay, one of the things that I did in the community during the election season of 2004 was that once a month I would go on an Hispanic radio station, and I don't speak a word of Spanish.
I was just going to say, do you speak Spanish?
Not a word.
But they made it work for you.
Well, what happened was that these were people who were living in an area they had moved here from Puerto Rico, U.S. citizens eligible to vote, who were living in very large, dense Puerto Rican communities, who went to vote on the primary day only to find that they had registered as independents, and Florida's a closed primary state, meaning they didn't know the rules.
Right.
And so I got a desperate telephone call from somebody who hosts a 6 a.m. show. Could you please come on the air and explain to people when they vote, what they vote for, how the Electoral College works, what offices are up, what's a political party office, what's a nonpartisan office, what's
all the things that so many of us
versus...
take for granted.
And she translated every answer and every question. So she did more of the work. The hard work for me was getting up at 4 a.m. to get there on time.
But what you did was got information out to a community would have not gotten it otherwise.
People Googled me, and I got so many emails from people that were in broken English. They could not speak English very well. Thank you so much. I voted. I learned so much from you. And so these are people who want to vote, and yet they showed up to vote, but because they didn't know the rules of the game, they ended up being turned away. So
the future is getting the information out. And thank you, Dr. Terri Fine, for what you've done and what I'm sure you're going to continue to do, and for being our guest here on Profiles.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for watching. I'm Charna Davis Wiese. We'll see you next time.